The rectangular marquee tool is easily one of the simplest selection tools in Photoshop, and at first glance it might seem too simple to really be useful. But as you'll see in this lesson, the rectangular marquee tool has a surprising degree of complexity. In this case, I just happen to have an image that contains a number of rectangular shapes we can select. The assumption here is that we want to apply some sort of change to the shutters on this building, which requires that we first make a selection of those areas. To put the rectangular marquee tool to use, of course, we need to first choose this tool, so we'll move to the toolbox and click the button for the rectangular marquee tool. You could also press the letter M for marquee on the keyboard, which is the shortcut for the rectangular marquee tool. With the rectangular marquee tool active, we can simply click and drag on the image in order to create a selection. In this case, obviously, I'm not actually trying to create an accurate selection, but rather just demonstrating the use of the tool. The point where I initially clicked will become a corner of my rectangular selection, but it doesn't need to be the top left corner. With the mouse button still held down, I can move my mouse up to the top right, and that initial point becomes the bottom left corner of the rectangular selection. And of course, I can continue moving around to define the exact shape and location of the selection. Once I'm happy with the result, in this case it's just a random selection of course, I can release the mouse button and my selection will be created. Keep in mind that we can also use the options to add to, subtract from, or intersect with the selection. By default, whenever we click and drag to draw a selection, we're replacing any existing selections. However, we could choose the Add option on the options bar and then click and drag to add to the existing selection. That additional area does not need to be discontiguous. For example, if I click and drag but then don't select the entirety of this shutter, I could simply click and drag again with the Add to Selection option enabled in order to add an additional portion to that selection. I can choose the Subtract option if I needed to subtract an area from a selection, and I can use the Intersect option if I want to create a selection that is the overlap of the existing selection and a new selection. In most cases, I leave the option set to the Create New Selection option and then use keyboard shortcuts to access the additional options. To add to selection, simply hold the Shift key while clicking and dragging to draw an additional area that you want to select. To subtract, hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh and then click and drag to define the area you want to subtract from the existing selection. And to intersect, on Windows you would hold the Shift and Alt keys, or on Macintosh you would hold the Shift and Option keys, and then click and drag to define the intersect selection. We also have the option to feather the selection while it's being created by a set number of pixels. You need to establish a value here before you draw the selection. My preference, though, is to not feather selections while I'm in the process of creating them. The anti-alias checkbox, as you can see, is not available, and that's because anti-aliasing is not necessary when we're creating selections comprised of perfectly vertical or perfectly horizontal lines, as is the case with the rectangular marquee tool. The style option essentially relates to the aspect ratio of our selections. With the normal option selected, we can draw a selection of any aspect ratio we'd like. If you'd like to constrain the aspect ratio, you can choose Fixed Ratio from the pop-up. In this case, I have my width and height both set to a value of 1, and so if I click and drag, I will get a square selection. It doesn't matter which direction I drag, I will only be able to get a square selection with this option set. I can also establish a selection of a specific size. For example, if I wanted to create a square selection of exactly 64 pixels by 64 pixels, I could set those values for width and height. Here, px is pixels, in would be inches, and cm would be centimeters. Then when I click, I don't even have to drag, I'll get a selection of exactly that size, with the top left corner of my selection defined by the point that I clicked. In most cases, of course, I use the normal option here. I'm going to zoom in so that we can get a closer look at the shutter in the center of the building here, and then we'll try drawing a selection that only includes this particular shutter. All I need to do is click at the top left corner and then drag to the bottom right corner. But if for any reason I have a difficult time with this, there's an additional option that can be very helpful. For example, I could click, and in this case I'll intentionally click in the wrong spot, and partway through creating the selection, I realize my mistake. Rather than releasing the mouse and then perhaps clicking to deselect and dragging again, I could simply adjust the selection while drawing it. So I'll go ahead and make the same mistake again, but this time I'll keep the mouse button held down. I can then press and hold the space bar to move the selection while I'm in the process of creating it. Keep in mind that I'm continuing to hold the mouse button down in order to make sure that I'm still in the process of creating my selection. After I've moved the selection, I can release the spacebar and then, with the mouse button still down, continue dragging to change the shape of the selection. I can continue in this manner as often as I need to, pressing the spacebar when I need to move my selection and releasing the spacebar when I want to change the shape of the selection. When I'm finished, I can release the mouse button to create that selection. In addition to using the Style pop-up to create a square selection, there's also an additional keyboard shortcut. If I hold the Shift key, I can create a square selection. Now, of course, you may realize that the Shift key is the way we access the Add to Selection option. It's all a matter of timing, though. If I draw a selection, and then hold the Shift key and draw another selection, I'll be adding to the existing selection. If I click without holding the Shift key, then I'm creating a new selection, since that's the option I have set on the options bar. But while drawing this selection, if I now add the Shift key, I will get a square selection. In addition, I can have a selection grow outward from a center point. Let's assume that I'm able to actually identify the center of these shutters. I can click and drag to start drawing a selection. In this case, of course, I get a selection where the point I initially clicked on is one of the corners. But if I want that point to be the center rather than the corner of a selection, I can press and hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh. Doing so will cause the point that I initially clicked to be the center of my selection, and my selection can then grow outward from that position. Once again, this is a matter of timing, because the Alt or Option key is also the Subtract from Selection option. So if I hold the Alt or Option key before I click and drag, then I will get the Subtract from Selection option. If, on the other hand, I start drawing and then add the Alt or Option key, that point will become the center. Let's take a look at some of the complexity that this enables. I could, for example, click and draw to create a basic selection, and now I want to add to my selection, but in the form of a square. So I'll hold the Shift key to access my Add to Selection option. But at this point, I don't need to continue holding the Shift key. I can let go of it, and I'm still in the Add to Selection mode. However, I could add the Shift key back again so that I get the Square option. So now I'm adding to my selection in the form of a square. And in fact, at this point, I could even add the Alt or Option key so that I'm adding to selection in the form of a square, and that square is growing outward from my initial selection point. Of course, in a more practical situation, we would be using the rectangular marquee tool in a much simpler way. For example, simply clicking and dragging to draw a selection of one of the shutters, and then either choosing the Add to Selection option from the options bar or holding the Shift key to access that same feature, we would add to our existing selection. In this way, we could build up a selection in multiple pieces. As you've seen in this lesson, the rectangular marquee tool includes more options than you might initially realize. While it isn't a selection tool you're likely to use very frequently, it is still a very useful tool you'll likely find yourself putting to use more often than you might expect.